We have literally driven to all 159 counties with our field staff, our volunteers, and our lawyers to collect these handwritten lists. I am happy to invite any member of the media to our campaign headquarters so you can review those lists and understand the large-scale potential disenfranchisement of voters we are talking about. This is not academic, folks. I invite you to our office to look through those stacks and see these first and last name and a 2-digit code. That's what we're dealing with, and that's why we're very optimistic that we will get the relief we are seeking.
So, Kirk Lauren, you know you're running out of time in terms of, they keep saying they'll be certified by Friday. So do you want the certification to go past Friday? Is that also what you want to do?
Well, as Judge Totenberg mentioned in her order issued yesterday night, and Judge Jones seemed to agree with, there are additional remedies past county-level certification. That is, that Judge Totenberg made clear that just as the county has an obligation to make sure that each vote is validly counted, the same obligation is placed on the Secretary of the State. And if the Secretary of State identifies errors, they need to go back to the counties and make sure those errors are corrected. The timetable that occurs on depends on the Secretary of State's ability to solve those problems and make sure that each vote is counted.
So you're saying it could be a couple more weeks before we have everyone votes counted?
In fact, the representations that I heard from the lawyers for the various counties and for the Secretary of State is that they are processing things efficiently and they believe they can get it done. And I think the press should hold them to that and insist that they do, in fact, remedy any problems that they believe they're capable of remedying in a timely manner.
The out-of-county votes, defense of 37. Counties have no way of knowing if someone voted in another county, accepting out-of-county votes, open up a scenario for voter fraud or double votes being counted in the election. What's your reaction to that?
Well, my first response is there's absolutely no possibility that will happen in this election cycle because this election is over. What I heard a number of those attorneys to say is that Georgia might be on the right step to verifying, but it might be a subsequent election cycle where that's available. Well, that's fine. They can get their ducks in a row for the next election cycle. There's no possibility that any of the folks who voted out of county were doing it as part of some fraud. And it's also, frankly, there is no empirical evidence to support that's a realistic risk. And frankly, it's a little bit of a nonsensical scenario because individuals who go and attempt to vote a second time in another county have to sign an oath for which they can be convicted of a felony and hand over their driver's license. So the scenario, the scare tactic that some of the attorneys talked about is very similar to going into a bank and handing your stick-up note on the back of your passport. It doesn't make any sense.
We can take two more questions.
Are you asking for all the statewide votes on those out-of-county individuals to be counted? Is that specifically what you're asking for?
It would be all the votes that that voter is eligible to cast, which predominantly would be state votes, but I think under at least some circumstances there are elections which they may be eligible for where the election barrier crosses county line.
So they could vote for a state representative. If I live in Gwinnett, but I'm registered in DeKalb, I can vote. Sorry, if I voted in the wrong county, can I vote for like the state representative in the proper county where I am registered to vote?
The way we'd suggest it works is exactly the same way it currently works if you vote out of precinct in the same county. So you take the ballot and all of the votes that were in fact cast that you were eligible to vote on count.
Lauren, do you have any comment on what happened at the state capitol today with Senator Williams and protest there?
Sure, the question was about the Capitol this afternoon. I think part of what we've been trying to emphasize in different ways is that this is not about a number that the Secretary of State puts on a website or that our campaign or anyone produces. This is actually about Georgians. It's about the constituents of elected officials. It is about people. And today there were people who came to the Capitol to raise this issue, to the people's house, in fact. And State Senator Nikema Williams was arrested by standing peacefully with her constituents. And they were literally only asking to be heard, demanding that this state count every vote. This is the most basic request we make of elected officials. And the Abrams campaign stands with Georgians. In fact, we are fighting for Republican votes right now. We are fighting for independent vote right now. We are fighting for all votes right now. The administration of this election that was a complete disaster impacts all voters, those who cast a ballot and those who did not because they couldn't miss their wages because they couldn't wait for 4 hours. It impacts those who still believe that the system is untrustworthy and didn't choose to participate. And so I applaud our elected officials who are serving the public, like Senator Williams and others. And I actually would make a suggestion to former Secretary of State Brian Kemp. If he would like to be governor, he has to be governor of everybody. Those who voted for Stacey Abrams, those who did not vote, and those who live in our state. And he should take a lesson from Senator Williams, who her public oath has meant standing with her constituents on the most basic act of their dignity and their vote. So I applaud her bravery, and I stand and we stand with voters and their stories and the demand that we count every vote.
That's Fox 5. I have a question. Well, do you still believe that there will be a runoff? Because a lot of people at home are like, we still believe there will be enough votes to bring Brian Kemp's numbers below.
On Sunday evening, we learned that another nearly 6,000 votes had been reported. Of those 6,000 votes, about 80% of them were for Stacey Abrams. These were not votes that any of us standing here knew about. Some of them were provisionals, but some of them were early votes and mail votes coming out of counties that had been labeled as 100% reported. I cannot predict what is going to happen in the next hour or tomorrow, which is why our legal strategy is not one of hyperbole or extreme measures. We are not asking for extended deadlines. We're asking currently for one more day to have county elections officials have the time to go make sure they've gone through all their records. And so I don't know what the outcome will be. What I do know is there were tens of thousands of Georgians who were told to vote a provisional or emergency ballot. And we need those counted. We absolutely need those counted. And whether or not it results in a runoff is to some extent, just one point of this. And we know today by our own count, again, our best efforts to go to all 159 counties that were given no guidance by the Secretary of State on how to manage this historic turnout. Our best count is there are still more outstanding ballots than the margin to put this race in a runoff. And all the data that continues to come in, it turns out these are Democratic ballots. If former Secretary Kemp felt confident that he had won this election, he would be standing right here next to us and saying, you know what, count every vote. But instead, the Republican Party just stood in a courtroom and argued against counting every vote. I think this is despicable, and I think Georgians of all partisan backgrounds need to join us in the call to count every vote so we can feel as though there's been some closure to this election.
This is the final question.
Can you talk about that language to the counties in their guidance and how it is left up to interpretation? Because that was one of the biggest issues that we heard.
Sure. Well, we think there were two fairly obvious problems with that guidance. The first is that all the guidance said is that counties had the option of not rejecting ballots. That did not give any specific guidance to the counties about what they were supposed to do, and it opens up the possibility that depending on which county you live in, you can vote in precisely the same manner, and you'll be counted if you live in one county, and you won't be counted in another. And Judge Jones obviously had grave concerns that raises due process problems, particularly when there is no opportunity to cure a rejected absentee ballot. The second problem with that guidance is that it purports to quote a previous AG determination that relies not just on Georgia law, but cites the Voting Rights Act and explains the actual standard that counties are supposed to apply, and that language is entirely missing. We don't know why, but it is absent from the guidance given to counties, even though it is federal law and it provides meaningful guidance on how counties should count absentee ballots.
I'll just make a final closing remark to be completely clear. When Brian Kemp decided to be a gubernatorial candidate, he chose to take the unprecedented step of remaining Secretary of State, the Chief Elections Officer. He owns this. The Secretary of State's office owns this, and his campaign owns this. And so we will remain steadfast on our mission to use the courts, to use all aspects of our campaign on this mission, which is so simple: count every vote. And we will not be deterred however long it takes. Thank you so much for your time.